Hey folks, welcome back. Hope you're doing well out there. And in today's video, I thought we would talk about something I think is really interesting that you may have considered or seen before, but maybe you haven't considered. And that is the role of meta emotions or meta thoughts, meta experience in your healing process, in your awakening or personal development process. So I'm going to explain to you what meta emotions are, and I'm going to give some examples of how they impact things here and why this is relevant. So this is actually a major piece of leverage you have to turn things around in your healing process that you may not be aware. So please join me. Let's talk about it. Alrighty, so let's talk about meta emotions. So let me just kind of define it off the bat so you know what the hell I'm talking about here and whether or not you want to watch the rest of the video. Then I'm going to give you a little context and then we'll give some examples here. So a meta emotion is basically an emotion about another emotion you're having. So the word meta, M-E-T-A, right? Like Facebook meta. Meta is a Greek word which means about or above, right? So a good example of meta, is, the obvious example in pop culture is meta commentary inside a movie about movies and movie making, right? So if you ever see a movie where they start commenting about films and filmmaking, or they are talking about, or if they break the fourth wall and turn to the audience and start talking to the audience about the movie, that is meta commentary. Another very simple example of what it means to go meta is a frame around a picture, right? So if you're hanging a picture, if you're hanging a photograph and you have a frame around it, the frame is meta to the picture. It holds and contains the picture inside of it. That makes sense. So meta experience is this layer, and there can be multiple layers of meta experience, by the way. But meta experience is this layer of experience about other experiences we're having, right? So it could be emotions about emotions, could be emotions about thoughts, right? Could be thoughts about thoughts, could be, reactions to thoughts, et cetera, right? So this can get very messy and very complicated, but there are simple examples we can look to here. And I want to start to illustrate how and why this is useful in your healing process or your awakening process. Okay, so the first example here, I'm thinking about, do I want to give context or examples? Let's go with examples and I'll give some context here. So the first obvious example here is when people are afraid of fear. So if you're doing any sort of therapeutic work with someone, so if I'm doing hypnosis or coaching with someone, one of the most common places where people will slow the process down, they'll get stuck, they'll get hung up, is their fear of their own fear, or their fear of being uncomfortable, or their fear of being overwhelmed, or their fear of processing emotions, or their fear of emotions themselves, right? So this is a meta fear. This is fear of fear, right? This is a meta emotion. So this is a classic dynamic and issue that pops up when people are trying to heal and sort things out. And the thing to consider about meta emotions here is that you have a choice point with your meta emotion, right? So maybe there's fear in you, right? Maybe there's, fear and avoidance in you, or maybe there's overwhelm in you, or maybe there's a strong emotion in you. And then there's this meta emotion about that. Usually that meta emotion about that, we have choice over. In other words, to some degree, it's a little bit of an attitude that we can tweak or shift, right? So for example, with fear of fear, what if we shift that fear of fear to curiosity about fear? Suddenly it's a whole different ballgame, right? Suddenly this person who's been afraid of their own fear, if they can find the ability to be curious about that fear, will start to make tons of progress in terms of healing or growth or insight or moving things or connecting with themselves or whatever needs to happen, right? So this is really, again, a huge leverage point that a lot of people don't realize they have. Let me tell you why I'm talking about this. Okay, so like I said in the intro, a lot of my clients, this is a place where things have been coming up in conversation. We're kind of noticing meta emotions and, working with that a little bit. Also, this is partly prompted because I recently connected with a meditation technique, which I'm going to share with you guys here, which is basically when you sit and you notice that your mind is perhaps busy and you notice that perhaps there are emotions present in you or body sensations or ruminations or whatever's there. The meditation technique is simply to note whatever that is and take pleasure in it being there. So if you sit and what's there is rage in the body, right? Taking pleasure in the presence of that rage, right? And so this is a meta attitude, a meta perspective on this core content of your emotions and what's happening inside your mind and in your body, right? Now, as you bring this meta perspective of pleasure to whatever phenomenon is happening in your nervous system, it starts to soften the charge and transform whatever it is that you're experiencing. And this is, what they would say neurolinguistic programming is if you pick up a picture frame by the frame, the whole picture moves with it. Same basic principle here. When we move meta emotions or meta thoughts, meta experience, the content that it's meta to also moves or changes, right? So that's kind of a simple example there. And there are tons of examples, right? So you want to start to look at what are the emotions you have about emotions and how could you change them, right? How could you shift to a different mindset, a different attitude, a different emotional response towards whatever the content in your mind and in your body is. So if, whatever, feeling or thought or experience, there's grief or shame or anxiety or, depression or whatever is there, if that's going to be there either way, because that's your body functioning properly and sending the signals that it needs to send so that it can get processed, if that's there and that's doing its thing, then the real question is, what's the attitude I want to take towards that? What's mindset that's going to be helpful here? And is it really helpful to have a dismissive or fearful or rejecting or, shaming, or a lot of times the meta emotion that people bring to their emotions is pretty negative, and then we wonder why we're stuck a bit, right? So I want to just get you thinking about this. So one thing to start to look at in yourself is meta emotions or meta thoughts and how that impacts the tone of what it is you're experiencing internally and subjectively. And again, seeing if you can play with that. Because again, this is often where we do have a choice point where, yes, it might be an emotion. I might be afraid of fear, but there's often, it's almost more like an attitude where you can kind of shift that fear if you wanted to. And it's a place where you can start to explore and maybe find leverage. So for whatever that's useful, for whatever use that might be for you, I hope you find it useful. And I guess that's it for now. Sorry for the awkward ending here. Love you guys. See you soon.